Li Lu.
Li Lu.
It's Li Lu.
Li Lu.
Why does Li Lu succeed so mightily? Well, partly he's sort of a Chinese Warren Buffett.
Li Lu is one of the greatest investors of all time. In 2006, his former professor at Columbia University, Bruce Greenwald, invested in Li Lu's fund and in 4 years made a 400% return. But that's nothing, because in 2008, Li Lu recommended the stock to Warren Buffett that made Buffett 25 times his money by 2021. And now Li Lu's got a book out called Civilization, Modernization, Value Investment in China that reveals everything about how Li Lu invests. But there's one big problem. It's only available in Chinese. That is until today, because I've translated the whole book thanks to Google Translate, which I had to supplement with as many resources I could possibly find, because sometimes I got some weird translations. In this video, you'll discover Li Lu's secrets to value investing, rational thinking, his favorite books, and so much more, including how you could possibly meet him, and his unbelievable negotiation hack. We've already covered the first half of his book in a previous video, which is linked in the description below, as well as any kind of corrections or resources that we mentioned throughout the entire video. But get ready to take some notes, because we've crammed a ton of Li Lu's insight into this video, and there's a lot for you to do during and after this video.
Come on, you guys have work to do.
Li Lu starts off this speech by saying how much he appreciates Peking University's value investing course. As far as he's aware, it's the only facility outside of Columbia University with an opportunity to learn value investing. I would also like to include YouTube on that list, but then again, sometimes I wouldn't.
Nice. Nice.
Hey, green means good, right?
In this speech, Li Lu lays out 4 questions he believes investors should ask themselves if they want to invest professionally. The first question is, what makes the asset management industry unique, and what are the ethical responsibilities? According to him, the way we judge the quality of asset management is so much more different than we would in any other business, even if they're still in the service industry. For example, if you sit down at a restaurant, you can pretty much tell right away if you think the quality of the food was worth what you paid or not.
Drake, you get to experience the $5,000 mac and cheese.
Okay.
Dude.
But in the asset management industry, it could take 5 to 10 years or even longer before you can get a true sense of how well they're performing. And even still, past performance is no guarantee of future results. Moreover, investors' pay could sometimes be detached from the actual results, sometimes even going against the interests of the client. Ultimately, Li Lu says the best thing for investors to do if they're looking to enter the field is to treat clients as if they're family members, and to be relentlessly seeking knowledge, pursuing truth, and chasing wisdom. The next question Li Lu asks students to consider is, what are the assets that are going to provide sustainable, reliable, safe, and efficient long-term growth? Here he provides a chart as a means to justify stocks as the best for long-term growth. According to his research, he sees that the average price-to-earnings ratio of stocks have been around 15 and have returned about 6.7% a year, which would make sense. Unfortunately, for those who believe in the regression of the mean, we are sitting slightly higher than that, 20 according to Value Line and 40 according to Shiller's PE ratio. The result is that stocks have phenomenally outperformed every other asset class, and Li Lu attributes this to 2 main factors. The first of which is GDP growth, which grows at around 3 to 4% a year, and the second of which is inflation, which grows at around 1.4% a year. And Li Lu believes that these conditions will continue and points to the work of Ian Morris, who successfully predicted the meteoric rise of GameStop's stock price. Nah, just kidding. Ian Morris worked on measuring GDP before GDP was even invented, or applicable for that matter, by studying estimated energy consumed as shown in this chart. Li Lu says that you can point to virtually any time frame on this chart and still see the exponential curve upwards, suggesting to him that GDP growth is a compounding force and very likely to continue, especially as we move towards a more globalized economy. How to become a good investor. Li Lu believes statistically the best method of investing is value investing. And for someone just starting out, this is the advice he would offer.
So as a young student and a young analyst or somebody who's interested in finance, I would strongly encourage you, the best way to do that is to study the successful practices in real life examples or history, but studied very well all the examples of great value investing decisions. If I were you, starting all over again, I would first study all the great examples in the past in which market went to the extreme on a small segment of securities that give you a tremendous margin of safety.
And that sounds like really great advice. In fact, on this channel, we might even make a series covering periods of times that offered investors a great margin of safety. Li Lu then goes on to say that these traits make up what a value investor is. Just kidding. These are the actual traits Li Lu says makes up a value investor. Lastly, is value investing applicable in China? As we discussed in the part 1 video in this series, Li Lu describes China's current state of affairs as being in the Civilization 2.5 state. Where China does have a focus on modern technology, it has yet to completely adapt a free market system, a combination of which would allow for tremendous growth, which is already pretty crazy to think about because China's already doing some phenomenal things like considering making an artificial moon that's 8 times brighter than the moon we already have, just to replace streetlights. Li Lu concludes the speech by saying that he hopes to see a world in the future that completely abandons tariff barriers and moves towards a more global economy in which China will play a much larger role. He is very optimistic about value investing in China, and then closes his speech by reminding the investors to treat their clients as if they're family. And that's the end of that speech. Li Lu starts off this lecture by exploring the history of the stock market dating about 400 years ago, when colonial businesses required so much capital that the kings of countries could no longer afford ventures, so they sought out investment from the public. The very nature from the start was gamble-esque and proved to be very successful. Today, that gamble-esque nature is surprisingly nowhere to be found.
Any amount of Dogecoin can be minted at any moment in time.
What does that mean?
Like they can just make more.
Cool.
What? No.
Li Lu says that about 95% of market activity is driven by speculation, which is troublesome when you add in the fact that people can exploit in ignorance of tax considerations and misinformation and performance, which isn't talked about enough. Agreed. Li Lu says that the remaining 5% of market participants are value investors. He then gives you a sneak peek into his value investing process to show you how the two market participants are set apart from each other. Early in his career, Li Lu invested in an unnamed cable company headquartered in Pennsylvania that we're just going to call Dunder Mifflin for fun and make it easier to follow along. At the time, Dunder Mifflin sold off some of its assets in exchange for stock in a company called Telecommunications Incorporated, or TCI for short. Li Lu didn't know how to do any kind of valuation for Dunder Mifflin, but what he could do is look up the stock price for TCI and found out that Dunder Mifflin's share of that was worth more than 2 times the market cap of Dunder Mifflin. Dunder Mifflin didn't have much earnings, but they were predictable and costs were really low. Additionally, Li Lu found out that TCI stock and the other subsidiaries that Dunder Mifflin owned operated as local monopolies, creating a great margin of safety. Overall, he saw it was an obvious great deal. Li Lu would be right. His investment would go on to be wildly successful for a multitude of factors. First of all, the telecommunications industry benefited from a tremendous tailwind as it became a nationwide sensation. And secondly, TCI would make many large acquisitions, increasing its earnings per share and creating this beneficial virtuous cycle. And lastly, Li Lu's rather unknown company would hire the president of the then largest telecommunications company to become its CEO, who I believe to be John Malone, making it an overnight success. Li Lu made many times his money and then sold it when he didn't understand the industry anymore. And despite the fact that the stock continued to rise many times over, Li Lu never regretted his decision because simply he just didn't understand the industry. Li Lu then recalls another instance of a company he invested into. Again, not mentioned by name, but this one had gas stations, which led Li Lu, the curious mind that he was, to learn everything and anything about gas stations, leading him to observe a phenomenon that was happening in his hometown. There were 2 gas stations at the same intersection with the same price for gas, but had completely different number of customers going in and out of them. There was one that was obviously more successful than the other. So Li Lu started doing his research and found out that the one that was more successful was owned by someone with an owner's mentality. Every time a customer came in, the owner would offer a free glass of water, a free car wash, and just start up a conversation, leading to about 3 times more customers than the other gas station. Li Lu learned about this style of moat just by being curious. Whereas curiosity seems dangerous for the cat, it seems wildly successful for the value investor. Li Lu then goes on to provide these character traits as a way to define a value investor. But what if you look at these character traits and decide that value investing might not be for you? Especially when you consider the fact that even brilliant minds like Isaac Newton can still fall for speculative bubbles, and that value investors like Charlie Munger have the patience to read 40 to 50 years worth of Barron's magazines before picking a single stock pick. What can the normal person or investor do to still do well for themselves? Li Lu believes the ordinary person can do really well for themselves just by passively indexing into the market. And he would much rather see people hold on to cash and wait for a wonderful opportunity than to make any kind of speculative bets on the market. Li Lu also provided this list as a set of criteria to use for anyone looking for an investor to manage their wealth for them. To give you an example of someone I personally believe that fits this list of criteria here, it would be Adam Mead at the Oracle's classroom. It's troublesome, though, for Li Lu to see normal investors being pushed products by investment managers when you really can't even get a true return of these products. Li Lu has even played with the idea of creating a small value investing village where everyone shares their true returns and how they got them. Now, reading this for myself, I couldn't help but draw parallels between this idea and Li Lu's belief on moving towards a more globalized economy. Both ideas draw on the philosophy of economist David Ricardo's idea on comparable advantages. Li Lu concludes the Peking 2019 lecture by sharing his meaning of life, which is the pursuit of knowledge. And then he opens it up to a Q&A section, which I won't share here, because in the description we have a link to a video we've already made that has Li Lu's full lecture with English subtitles. So you can watch that for the full effect if that's what you want. But I can't wait any longer. This next part is my favorite part, and that is Li Lu's 2006 lecture at the Columbia University. The 2006 Columbia University lecture is hands down my favorite. In this lecture, Li Lu provides his complete investing process in incredible depth by providing 2 investments he's made in the past as examples. Because there's so much value to be had from this video, I've decided to dedicate a whole video in this series towards it, but we'll still cover the most important parts of this lecture. First, Li Lu discusses that the stock market's really made for speculators, and that, like we said earlier, only about 5% of market participants are value investors, which are defined as those investors who see stocks as pieces of businesses, who use a margin of safety, think Mr. Market is irrational, and stay within their circle of competence. For what it's worth, I'd also like to add that value investors use an understanding of biases and opportunity costs for decision making. After his introduction, Li Lu walks through his 2 investments using his investing process and checklist. The items on his checklist are: is the business cheap? Is the business a good business? Who's running the business, and what did I miss? When we release the full summary of this 2006 Columbia lecture, we're going to provide to you the same documents that the students had in that lecture, so you can relive the experience as if you were there and see if you can keep up with the Chinese Warren Buffett, and believe me, it is very difficult. Until then though, I highly recommend you do not watch that lecture, or else it'll water down the experience for you. Also, when we release that video, we're going to provide some bonus content and do things like, I don't know, expose some things about Li Lu's process that even he doesn't know, and we'll also reveal Li Lu's secret investing formula, which is... I know, right? The last thing I want to cover for now is that Li Lu believes his biggest mistakes have come from the opportunity cost of not attracting enough capital when one of those rare opportunities have presented itself. Li Lu believes that these handful of opportunities that you get in a lifetime don't come around evenly. Sometimes you wait forever, and sometimes they happen all at once. Either way, he believes that you have to be ready to seize those opportunities when they come, and he'll only sell them if he's made a mistake, something about the business and its advantages have changed, if he believes that after taxes and fees, his money is better suited in a different investment, or never. If a business is truly wonderful, he will never have to sell. 3 times a year, Columbia University puts out a newsletter called Graham and Doddsville, where they share interviews from famous investors, the stock picks of MBA students, and announce investing events. Li Lu made an appearance in the 18th edition in spring 2013, which was included in the book in a more organized way. Now, fortunately for everybody, this interview is public, and I have it linked in the description. So instead of giving you a summary, I'm just going to give you the 3 main takeaways, or my 3 favorite parts, of this interview. Li Lu believes the process of investing is making a prediction about the future, which is inherently unpredictable. Therefore, it's all a matter of statistics. And in order for Li Lu to feel competent enough to have a view about what's going to happen in the future, he quotes Charlie Munger, who says, "You better be able to argue the opposing view better than the smartest person with that view." So that's the benchmark Li Lu uses to make decisions. Li Lu has no biases as to how opportunities reach him. He'll read all the major newspapers, he'll read the annual reports of all the leading companies, and he'll simply just chat with people until one of those rare opportunities jump out at him. He also has no biases for whether a company's in a certain country or industry, like tech, for example. In fact, he considers all companies to be a tech company. As long as it fits within his circle of competence, which he's naturally developed over time through his insatiable curiosity, he's willing to do the research. Although he does admit that early in his career he was focused on buying cheap stocks and has since seen himself transition into buying wonderful companies that focus on win-win scenarios, as Peter Kaufman would say. Li Lu has had a rocky journey ever since his fund's inception in January 1998. He quickly experienced the Asian financial crisis, the dot-com bubble, and the Great Financial Crisis of 2008 and 2009, all of which were described by many as once-in-a-lifetime events, and yet Li Lu chides happened every 5 years or so. In the first year, the investors lost 19%, which obviously worried people and even caused one of the largest investors to withdraw the funds in the second year. On top of that, the large upfront cost threatened the survivability of Li Lu's fund. However, in late 1998, Li Lu made the 3 or 4 best and most important financial decisions of his life, which caused him to make the returns back many times over. To this, he credits the tutelage of Buffett and Munger for giving him the wherewithal to know how to recover from his setback. Through this time, Li Lu experienced tremendous growth. For example, in 2003, Li Lu stopped the practice of shorting altogether. After the Asian financial crisis happened, Li Lu was using shorting as a way to hedge a portfolio so he wouldn't see the losses he once had. However, what he found was that during the dot-com bubble, because he was going both long and short securities, he was not able to pile into the stocks he liked best, even though he saw that the opportunities were once in a lifetime. In addition, Li Lu believes that the trend of the modern technological era is to grow continuously with compound interest, and is therefore more conducive to going long stocks than going short. For these reasons and others, he's just quit the practice of shorting. Ultimately, though, the best way to prepare for events like the ones Li Lu experienced is to know that the very moment you invest into a stock, something drastic can happen. And inevitably, someday it will happen. And according to Li Lu, it'll test your intellectual honesty, which is a term Li Lu uses to describe how honest you are with knowing what you know, knowing what you don't know, knowing that you don't have to know things, and then realizing that there's always a possibility you don't know what you don't know. Lastly, ever since Munger joined the fund, it's been closed to new investors, which at first I was really mad about until I realized that the fund requires a minimum commitment of $25 million, and I don't have that, so... The reason why Charlie Munger and Li Lu have decided to shut off the fund is because Li Lu's goal isn't to be the largest fund, it's to be the one with the best return. So instead of continually asking for capital, instead he's going to wait for those rare opportunities where he needs to attract capital and then accept money at that time. And of course, I couldn't conclude this article without sharing how Li Lu believes he's going to accomplish this goal, and that's through the continual process of optimizing opportunity cost. Much of the 2018 Harvard lecture was repeating things Li Lu has already said in the past, but there were 2 main concepts that really jumped out at me. The first of which is that Li Lu believes index investing cannot be sustainable long term. If everyone were investing into index funds, there'd be no price discovery, which is essential for our market to exist. Now, does Li Lu believe it'll ever get to this point? No. In fact, 1 year later, during the 2019 Peking University lecture that we just went over, Li Lu said that because there have always been a much larger percentage of speculators in the market, he doesn't see indexing ever getting to the point where it supersedes the speculators. Additionally, we have yet to see indexing disrupt price discovery in the market. Furthermore, he also said he wishes to see index investing become popular in China because it appears to be the easiest, fastest, and largest way to increase the level of investment in a market. But he just uses all this information to explain why value investing is so important, because it gives the price discovery that the market really needs. The other point Li Lu made was that value investors don't have to be right often. If you strip out the top 15 ideas of Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, you'll find that the ideas came to them very sparsely and yet made them a ton of money. As for himself, Li Lu said that he went from a negative net worth to doing pretty well for himself by having no more than 10 great ideas in all his 26 years of investing. So if he has to wait, he will. Now this lecture is pretty unique. At the time, there was a lot of pessimism around China's macroeconomic environment. And while Li Lu isn't a macroeconomic style investor, he could use this as an opportunity to speak about the case for China's future. At the beginning of China's 5,000-year history, the plain between the Yangtze River and the Yellow River was very fertile, allowing for agriculture and travel to flourish very early on. As bountiful as this land was, China would inevitably get caught up in something called the Malthusian trap, which, as we covered in the first video in our series, meant that if a land has the resources to grow and develop, it will, until it hits a cap where it can no longer sustain its development, causing wars, famines, plagues, and other terrible things. This usually meant that civilizations would go out and conquer other territories to reclaim more resources so it can continue to grow and develop. Now, because of China's geography, this meant that it inevitably got caught up in a unified empire with a political meritocracy. On the other hand, the West, mainly Europe, has a geography that's chaotically divided by mountains and a complex river system that made it easy to defend and hard to attack. It's much like the difference between roads in New York and roads in Boston. Therefore, the West wouldn't unify and instead set up a free market economy which would allow countries to transact trade, of which Li Lu says is one of the two most important factors in a developing civilization. The other being a focus on modern technology, which would come shortly because the West would have one more advantage over the East, and that was location. Li Lu shows us that while the Atlantic Ocean separates Europe and the Americas by about 3,000 miles, the Pacific Ocean separates China and the Americas by about 6,000 miles or more if you take into consideration the currents. So it's pretty obvious to us why Europe would discover the Americas first. And the discovery of the Americas by Europe was monumental because it allowed them to avoid the Malthusian trap, made easier by the fact that the germs the Europeans brought over pretty much wiped out the indigenous population, making it really easy to conquer. The rush to America created a demand for modern technology. Combined with the free market system they had earlier, created what Li Lu calls the single greatest institutional innovation of our time, an economic meritocracy. China was completely shut off from this development. In 1840, China was still struggling with the Opium War and was forced to open its doors to the rest of the world. At that time, China was still mainly agricultural, while the rest of the world was living it up in the glamorous period of industrialization. To make matters worse, China rebuilt their civilization under the Communist Party and didn't do so well. But as we all know how the story goes, things are about to change for China. Deng Xiaoping came into power in 1978 and made a very practical observation. He noticed that after World War II, all the countries that partnered with America became very rich, and all the countries that partnered with the Soviet Union became very poor. As a result, Xiaoping met with Jimmy Carter, the US president, and established US-China diplomatic relations, something that Xiaoping treasured very dearly. He then advocated for a free market economy, and his efforts produced miraculous growth. Fast forward till today, and China has some advantages that make it really unique. For example, there's a lot more competition among the local governments. For example, if a business wants to invest and set up a factory in a location, a local government can help by providing land, road, bridges, changes to the tax code, and even going to the extent of buying out production. While this has produced high-speed growth, it has also spawned serious corruption, a widening wealth gap, and a debt-driven economy. However, China's growth is slowing, and US-China tensions are increasing. There's an escalating concern that China will collapse. And yes, the tensions are negative, but Li Lu suggests there's a very strong tailwind propelling China and cites the work of economist William Arthur Lewis and his theory on the Lewis turning point as the reason why he believes China still has much more room to develop. Early in the industrialization period, economies went through the Lewis turning point, where labor surplus transitioned into labor shortage, creating bargaining power for the working environment. The bargaining power allowed for higher wages, which allowed for higher savings, which allowed for higher consumption, which allowed for higher profits, creating this virtuous cycle. Many consider this a golden age, but it had a very unique consequence. Companies during this time slowly started transferring investments to developing countries where parts and labor could be made cheaper. Done on a large enough scale, domestic investment decreases precipitously and brings with it the wages and labor. American economist Richard Koo describes this stage as the pursued phase of the post-Lewis turning point. Li Lu estimates that the West probably entered this international investment stage in the late 70s. China is currently in its golden ages. Wages, savings, investments, and consumption are in this positive cycle spiraling upwards. In addition, education, GDP per capita, and R&D expenditures per capita are in excess multiple times over that of the US. All of this means that in the next 5 years, China has real potential to reap the seeds they've sown. And Li Lu believes the secret to unlocking this potential lies in many factors like urbanization, an increase in savings rate, a decrease in domestic bank debt, and an easy avenue for companies looking to go public, for example. This puts the West at a frictional divide, though, because while the private sector would love to see higher gains through international investments, it hurts the domestic economy, causing slower economic growth and inflation. Li Lu believes that to overcome this will take strong monetary policy, which is weak in the West. Li Lu concludes this speech by reiterating the fact that value investors work from the bottom up, meaning that they don't need to know everything on a macroeconomic scale, only to see the general trend. Yes, US-China tensions are increasing, but he sees the fact that China is no longer completely dependent on exports and is slowly growing into an import economy. As such, Li Lu says he sees many outstanding companies in China that are very similar to the ones in the West, but have found ways to grow cheaper and more efficiently. And this is his case for investing in China. The last section of this book is on reading, rational thinking, and feeling. It starts off with the preface to Poor Charlie's Almanac written by Li Lu for the Chinese and Taiwanese versions. In that preface, he shared how he first met Charlie Munger. After graduating Columbia University, Li Lu worked as an intern at the law firm Summer, Thatcher & Bartlett. He then worked for 4 months at the investing banking firm Allen & Company, and then worked for 2 years as a corporate financial associate at the investing banking firm Donaldson, Lovekin, and Jenrette, or DLJ for short. It was sometime during these jobs where Li Lu first met Charlie Munger, except nothing came of it. In 1997, Li Lu was catching a red-eye flight from San Francisco to New York when he ran into his friend Rena Shulsky, a Manhattan real estate entrepreneur. She convinced Li Lu to start his own fund, thinking that he can do way better for himself than be working at some law firm like DLJ. She committed $2 million in seed money, and we all know what happened next. On Thanksgiving 2003, Li Lu and Charlie Munger met again, but this time they truly had a heart-to-heart. With Charlie Munger's help, Li Lu completely changed the structure of his fund to more closely mirror Warren Buffett's Buffett Limited Partnership Fund and become a long-only equity-based fund. Since then, Charlie's been a wonderful mentor to Li Lu and an enormous influence. Li Lu says that Charlie Munger has the best model for thinking, which allows him to understand the most complex businesses faster than anyone in the entire world. Charlie always starts by thinking backwards and voraciously reads how businesses fail, how to better suit his circle of competence, and behavioral philosophy. Li Lu likens Charlie Munger to a German philosopher and scholar who practices the way of Confucianism and Tao. And by the way, he's witty too.
What's your dream now? He says,
My dream. Well,
let's skip the first one.
It should probably come to no surprise to you that Li Lu is an avid reader, and as such couldn't help himself from including book reviews of 2 books that have greatly influenced his life. Now, I'm not going to summarize these book reviews for you here, but instead in the description, I have the complete list of Li Lu's book recommendations, not just the ones mentioned in this book, but all his book recommendations. Fair warning though, there are a ton of books. In 1997, Li Lu spoke at the TED 7 conference, and while he was happy to present, he found himself absolutely immersed in other people's lectures. And since then, it's been an event he's tried to attend every single year, which is pretty cool to us because that means if you want to front the measly $5,000, you might actually be able to meet Li Lu. And as much as I'm joking about that, it honestly might even be worth it. In the book, Li Lu included an article he wrote to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the TED conferences and highlight some of the lectures he found most impressive, such as the one by Hugh Herr at the MIT Media Lab, who created a prosthetic for a Boston Marathon victim that was unbelievably natural. Li Lu also gave praise to Will Marshall and his team for creating an ultra-small satellite that they created in a garage. Elon Musk's ambition to bring people to the moon for $500,000, and many others that I'll leave in the description. The most important thing Li Lu wanted to share with writing this article was that he was very optimistic and excited about the future. And speaking of the future, at the very beginning of the series, I told you that acclaimed author Leo saw Li Lu make predictions 20 years ago that came true today, and is very excited about the predictions he's making today to come true in the future. If I had to guess, I would say that the TED conferences have a huge role to play in these predictions. This is one of my favorite parts of the entire book. Li Lu wrote to celebrate the 2016 New Year, and after having recently watched The Big Short, chose to reflect on the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis. Leading up to the Great Financial Crisis, in 2005 and 2006, Li Lu accidentally stumbled upon credit default swaps. Being the super curious mind that he was, he decided to do a ton of research and found out that he could make a ton of money if the market crashed by short selling these credit default swaps. This is the exact same thing that Michael Burry did that made him so much money and so famous that they had a movie based off of him. And Li Lu was planning on entering a position in a massive way. Li Lu brought the idea to Charlie Munger to hear his thoughts on it, and Munger objected. And his reasoning was pretty simple. If Li Lu turned out to be correct, then the counterparty wouldn't be able to pay Li Lu and would require government assistance. That government assistance would come in the form of a government bailout, which would either directly or indirectly come from the taxpayer, and that wasn't ethical. Moreover, Charlie argued that if an investor can be right on a short position once, they'll be psychologically tempted to think that they can do it again, despite the fact that humans are naturally terrible at predicting such events. And so, Li Lu never made a bet like Michael Burry did and never regretted the decision. Instead, Li Lu watched as Charlie Munger's predictions all came true. In early 2017, a number of astonishing events happened in modern technology within a short period of time that caused Li Lu to want to reflect on them. NASA discovered a solar system about 40 light years away with 7 planets that could potentially sustain life. Elon Musk announced that SpaceX would be sending paying customers to the moon's orbit by 2018. The WMO confirmed record high temperatures in Antarctica, and microfossils found in ancient Canadian rocks led to discovery of life on Earth some 500 million years earlier than we thought. He finds himself fascinated with all these developments, and he also shared with us the fact that he was spending a lot of time with some of the most progressive minds of our time, including the authors of the books he recommends. He is constantly amazed by the developments of the world and is happily awaiting the next surprise. However, he warns that technology should come with insurance. And to illustrate, Li Lu provided an anecdote of when his 13-month-old daughter first learned to walk. When Bella, his 13-month-old daughter, first learned to walk, Li Lu was out celebrating while Bella's mother was right to work building a fence around the pool. And that brings us to the bittersweet ending of this book. Li Lu's reflections on turning 50. Li Lu was born April 6, 1966, in the midst of a Chinese Cultural Revolution. And despite the challenges he faced, he cherishes the journey and the people he met along the way. In his 50 years, he spent nearly half of it in China and half of it in the US, and admits that he probably has some kind of identity crisis. But it wasn't until he turned 40 did he finally come to peace and realize that he is both 100% Chinese and 100% American simultaneously. This is something he hopes to embody more of in the second half of his life. The very thing Li Lu is most proud of is his 3 children, who he hopes will help share with the responsibility of making the world a better place. Specifically, Li Lu hopes to leverage his deep care and understanding of US and China relations with his family, so that way they can help the countries better understand each other and to provide quality education to deserving young people. He wraps up his speech by wishing everybody to become wiser with age and younger with heart, always. And that is the end. Or not, I might have one more surprise for you. At the end of this speech, Charlie Munger took questions about Li Lu, and the first one was how they came up with an intrinsic value of BYD. Charlie said it was fundamentally very difficult and not something they could have done without Li Lu. Li Lu helped him realize that Wang, the CEO of BYD, was a genius in his industry who made tremendous strides, and that the venture capitalist market alone was undervaluing BYD by about a third. In the second question, relating to how they treat minority owners, Charlie Munger made a distinction between the negotiation practices of GE and Li Lu. Apparently, GE is notorious for the final sudden trick negotiation tactic, where at the very end of negotiations, when pretty much all is said and done, GE tries to slide in one final trick just to squeeze out any inkling of extra cash that they can get, which just frustrates everybody. And apparently, Li Lu does the same thing, but with his own twist. In negotiations, as Li Lu's final sudden trick, Li Lu says, "Look, for us, this investment is only a small amount of money, but you have invested all your wealth in it. I must add a supplementary cost. If we lose money, we return the money you invested. I can't sign a contract with you without adding this clause." How wonderful of a way to behave. Charlie Munger's last question expands on that and his philosophy of finding a win-win scenario. He said, sure, you can be like the Summer Redstones, the Carl Icahns, and the Donald Trumps of the world that bully suppliers, but Munger would much rather create a system where the suppliers can trust him, he could trust the suppliers, and they create a win-win scenario. The difference that Charlie Munger sees in GE and Li Lu only demonstrates how strong Li Lu's moral compass is. And that is the end of our review. I hope you enjoyed our review of Li Lu's Civilization, Modernization, Value Investment in China. Our review of the 2006 Columbia lecture should be coming out very soon. And if you're subscribed with the notification bell turned on, YouTube will let you know as soon as it comes out. And if it's already out by the time you watch this, we'll have a playlist linked in the description or the comment section. There's still so much more we could have added, but that's all we have time for. And we look forward to everyone sharing their findings in the comment section below. This was our biggest project by far and took us months to put together, so we really appreciate you watching till the very end. But thank you, and until next time.